about what happened in the most recent ranked choice voting elections in the Bay Area, November in 2018. If you joined us before, we had a previous webinar showcasing what happened in the June San Francisco mayoral election earlier this year, and we're excited to be able to provide this presentation again for all of you. So thank you for joining. Let's see here. So Fairville, California, we are a nonprofit organization working to provide greater choice and a stronger voice in our elections so that we have a democracy that works for everyone, for all of us. And one of the issues that we champion is something called ranked choice voting. For the agenda to today, for the webinar, we're going to go through quite a few races in the Bay Area. So you get hands-on knowledge or data, up-to-date data about what happened in those races. So in the next slide, we'll go through the agenda real quick. There were a lot of races in San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, and San Leandro. These are the particular races that we're going to provide some information on. The Berkeley City Council districts of 1, 4, and 7, Oakland mayor's race, as well as the city council districts of 2, 4, and 6, the San Leandro mayoral race, as well as the city council district 1, and San Francisco Board of Supervisors, the election for districts 2, 4, 6, and 10. Before we dive into these races, I wanted to give you all a context of what ranked choice voting actually is. As you may know, it's pretty self-explanatory. You're ranking your choices on the ballot, first choice, second choice, and third choice, and so on. And by doing that, you're able to provide fair elections. And that's because the elections are more fair, with the results being a clear majority winner in one election versus two. So not a primary election or a runoff election. It fosters stability. So this idea that candidates, instead of going really negative in a primary election, for example, and then trying to coalesce with the defeated candidates to then become a majority winner in a runoff election. In this case, we saw some really interesting races where candidates aligned with each other because of common values or common issue areas, and some even campaigning together. Reducing costs, as I mentioned before, by having only one election versus two. In San Francisco, they save over $4 million now by not having that second mayoral election or the 6 figures that some of these supervisor races cost. And by doing that, you're also supporting greater voter participation because you're not encouraging voters to come out twice, but rather one, in one higher turnout, more diverse electorate. And then finally, minimizing strategic voting, vote splitting, and a spoiler effect, because by ranking your choices, you are not hurting any one of your top choices because your second choice only comes into play if your first choice is eliminated. And so by doing this, you don't have to strategically vote and feel like your vote might be wasted, or you have to vote the lesser of two evils, which is really exciting to see that the Bay Area is leading the way in how we can have fair elections. One thing we want to, a disclaimer that we have in the next slide, shows that the Alameda County, their registrar of voters, currently does not bring the final election results to the last two remaining candidates. What that means is across the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, for example, they run the full electoral tabulation to the final two candidates. When you do that, you're able to provide better transparency to what the voters' intent and the will of the voters, what they had wanted for their choices as to who they wanted to represent them. And so you get a chance to see what the voter mandate is when you run the final electoral count to the last two remaining candidates and see how they fared head to head. Because Alameda County currently doesn't do this, our hopes are that they will in the near future. The data that you'll see for some of these races in Alameda County, which means the cities of Berkeley, Oakland, and San Leandro, we've gone in and provided that analysis for you. So there's a lot to share. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Pedro Hernandez, to then talk about the results.
Hey folks, this is Pedro Hernandez. I'm the Deputy Director of Fairville, California. Like Jen said, there was a lot of races in the East Bay and in San Francisco. We're going to kick things off with the Berkeley City Council elections. There were 4 elections this November, and the elections were District 1, District 4, District 7, and District 8. A little background is that in District 1, after serving the city for 25 years, and Mayo retired from the city council. There were 4 candidates vying for that open seat. And then in District 4, we had 2 candidates challenging incumbent Kate Harrison, who had been elected in the 2017 special election to fill the remaining term of now Jesse Arreguin. And in District 7, after serving the city for 22 years, Chris Worthington retired from office. This was another open seat election where actually that district is the first majority student district in the country, and that happened as a result of a 2012 voter passed initiative. There were 3 candidates in that race, and in District 8, there were 3 candidates challenging the incumbent Lori Dorsey, and that meant well, let's jump into District 1 elections. This was the only race in Berkeley that went into multiple rounds of count, meaning that no candidate received 50% plus 1 in the first round. This meant, as Jen pointed out, that the candidate with the fewest first choice votes was defeated, and the voters who supported that defeated candidate had their second choice count. And we, just an overview is that in that district election, 83.3% of voters indicated at least 2 preferences. In the final count, now City Councilor-elect Rashi Kisarwani was elected with 54.3%. And in that race, 96.2% of voters had a final say, meaning that that's how many votes counted in that final decisive round. It was a pretty straightforward race. Kashi Kisarwani led in the first round, and in the instant runoff, increased her lead to that 54.5%. And in the next slide, we'll show you what happened in that tabulation. So we see that in the first round, like I said, Rashi Kisarwani led with 44.5%, and the other candidate had 35.7%. And when the instant runoff happened, the voters who supported as their first choice Mary Beth Steinberg, more voters favored Igor Trigub, and when Margot Schuler was defeated, more of her votes supported Rashi Kisarwani. And you don't really get to see this through the Alameda County ROV, but here is the race when you run the countdown to 2. In the next slide, we have Berkeley District 4 candidates. There were 3 candidates challenging Kate Harrison, the incumbent. Ben Gould had previously run for mayor in the past, so he was a familiar name to many. Ben Gould and Gregory Matgonia did run a ranked choice voting strategy. However, when you look at the public record, you weren't able to see that how much of the votes from Matgonia went to Ben Gould. So we ran the countdown to 2, and what we see is that Gould received 63.8% of Matgonia's first choice of votes. But in the end, that actually, because their ranked choice voting was preempted by the outright win of Kate Harrison, you don't get to see that, but here we see that Kate Harrison wins when you narrow the race down to 2, 56.5 to 43.5. Interesting note, Kate Harrison shows up on 83.8% of ballots as 1, 2, or 3. So she is a very popular candidate, and we weren't necessarily surprised by this win. In the next slide, we'll go to Berkeley District 7. This was a one round win where 81.2% of voters had at least 2 different choices on their ballots. Rigel Robinson won outright in the first round, but when you narrow the race down to 2, Rigel wins 62.3% to 37.7%. And this was, again, in the first majority student district in the country here in Berkeley. And yeah, so we'll go to the next slide. We're running through these pretty quickly just because there's so many races. See, here we have Berkeley District 8. This was, again, a 1-round election. 78.9% of voters had at least 2 different candidates on their ballots. Lori Dorsey wins outright in the first round with 56.2. When you narrow down the race to 2, Mary Kay Lacey comes up, but only to 37.1, and Lori has 63.9. This was a pretty straightforward race. And let's see, we'll move to the next city. So here was probably the race that a lot of people had their eyes on, is the mayoral election. Just for background, in 2014, Libby Schaaf unseated incumbent Jean Quan in a field of 16 candidates, and she was able to do so by courting a base of first choice support and picking up the second and third choice supports of defeated candidates. In that race, Schaaf won 63.20% in the ranked choice voting count. That's narrowed down to 2. This year, Schaaf faced 9 challengers, and a lot of people want, this was again a first round win. So we'll go to the next slide. You probably know by now that Mayor Schaaf handily won this re-election. She did so by winning outright with 50% plus 1 of first choice votes in the first round. However, we also know that a large number of voters indicated more than one choice on their ballots. And we also know that there were a few candidates who were running a ranked choice voting strategy. So I wanted to take an opportunity to unpack that and see what happened. So, but before that, let's talk about, just generally in Oakland, what we've seen in the past. This was the highest turnout since ranked choice voting has been implemented in Oakland. However, from 1992 to 2010, when you compare that to, primary elections, they were pretty low. We saw that turnout in June, when Oakland had June elections, was 39% less than turnout in November. So we're very proud that the reform has been working out the way it has in Oakland, with more voters actually having a greater say in a higher turnout election. How voters have been using ranked choice voting is on the next slide. We saw that there was high use of rankings, in this race, 72.1. However, we did see higher use of rankings in the last election, but we weren't too surprised to see lower use of rankings, just because we actually see, a lot of factors depend on, how often people will have more than one candidate. How strong an incumbent is in the race has a lot to do with it. How competitive the race is as well. So 72.1% is high, not as high as, the last mayoral election, but a lot of people did use their rankings in this election. Again, there was very low error rate in the RCB ballots in Oakland, just 1195 with great participation. We see that overvotes were, very low. So and this is a trend that you see across, jurisdictions of ranked choice voting, is that we actually see pretty low error rates compared to other election systems. Like when voters are given a ballot to, choose 3, they may end up choosing 4 or 5 and invalidating the entire ballot. Or in the top 2 primary in June, we saw a lot of overvotes when the ballot instructions were just like, pick 1, and people ended up picking 2 or 3. But with ranked choice voting, we think that voters find it intuitive to rank things. You rank things every day. If you don't have your favorite ice cream flavor at the store, you're going to pick your second favorite, and so on. So let's go to the next slide. Here is the instant runoff when you narrow down the race down to 2. So we know in the first round, Libby Schaaf wins outright with 53.28%. But if you eliminate the candidates that trailed before, and we did so, we consolidated rounds 1 through 8 here, just because a lot of these candidates did not have enough support they would have had, that they would have been able to, move ahead. But what we see is that in round 6, Libby Schaaf had 56.45%, Kat Brooks would have had 28.36%, and Pamela Price would have 15.19%. When Pamela Price is defeated, a substantial amount of her votes go to Kat Brooks. About 60% of her votes that transfer go to Kat Brooks. However, it's not enough to catch up to Libby Schaaf, who would lead with 63.5% to Kat Brooks's 36.5%. So I'll leave this here for a second because I know a lot of people were really curious about seeing this. But so have a moment and let's go to the next slide. Here in this slide is the final round by precinct. Here in dark purple, and purple is the support for Libby Schaaf, and then in the reddish orange color is the support for Kat Brooks. As you can see, if you're familiar with Oakland geography, you know that the darker purple is the hills in the eastern parts of Oakland. But I think what you saw here is that Kat Brooks had a lot of support in the west side of Oakland and some pockets of the east side of Oakland as well, and some southern parts. So in the next slide, we think that ranked choice voting is more representative generally than you would have seen in a two-round election. The voters having their ballots count in every election was high. It was 75.8%. Wait, these numbers, yeah, but lower than 2010, right? So that was 88.4. And then to the next slide, we compare the number of exhausted ballots versus exhausted voters. So, you know, we used to see, so the 19.2% figure is the figure of people who didn't have a finalist on their ballots. And we compare that to the number of people who wouldn't show up to that first round of election. We do this with runoffs in San Francisco, where we look at the runoff rates in December, for example. But we think with ranked choice voting, it's a lot more representative because you had a lot less people show up in June traditionally. So therefore, you had greater say in the election. We're going to move to the next slide, which is the Oakland City Council elections. There were three really competitive elections, I think, just because there tends to be, you know, the Oakland electorate tends to be very engaged. So we had elections in District 2, in District 4, and in District 6. In District 2, we saw two candidates challenge incumbent Councilmember Abel Guillen, who had served for office for 4 years. And in District 4, we saw Councilmember Ann Campbell Washington announce that she would not be seeking re-election after 4 years on the council. This created an open seat, which was fairly competitive. And in District 6, we saw 4 candidates challenge incumbent Councilmember Dudley Brooks, who was first elected in 2002. So let's go to District 2. Here, the candidates were Nikki Fortunado Boss and Kenzie Smith, and the incumbent Abel Guillen. This was a first round election, first round win, an outright win, where Nikki Boss Fortunado was able to get 53.9% of first choice votes, doing something that doesn't happen very often, which is unseat an incumbent. Incumbency rates are under ranked choice voting are really no different than any other election systems. Incumbents usually fare pretty well under any election system. What you'll learn about unseating incumbents if you are a campaign person is that you have to really make the case that that person should be fired and, you know, your candidate should be hired. But what we saw play out in this race was an outright win for Nikki Fortunado Boss. When you run the count down to 2, you saw that Nikki Fortunado Boss wins 57.2 to Abel Guillen's 43.8. So she was able to actually get more support from Kenzie Smith voters. And the next slide, this is one we'll spend a little more time on because it actually went into multiple rounds. This is Oakland City Council District 4. Just generally, the voters really engaged with the ranked choice voting. 79.6% of District 4 voters had at least 2 different preferences. One thing to note is that Charlie Michelson, one of the candidates, dropped out of the race. However, their name still appeared on the ballot. What that meant is that, you know, this happens in races sometimes when candidates decide to drop out and their ballots are still there. So we do run the countdown as well under those circumstances. But in the first round, Shang Tao led with 34.7%, Pam Harris 27.1%, and Nayeli Maxon 16.2%. Charlie Michelson, the candidate who had withdrew from the race, had 11% of votes. And so in the final count, we see that Shang Tao wins 54.1 to Pam Harris's 45.9. Interesting things to note about this race is that there was a ranked choice voting strategy among the women in the race where they really wanted to see one of the women be elected. When Charlie Michelson withdrew from the race, he was kind of the lead, the other lead candidate. So we actually saw a race really was about those three candidates, and how the ranked choice voting votes were going to go was really about who was able to have a lot of first choice support. So in this next slide, we ran the count down to 2, which Alameda ROV did, but we wanted to visualize it so people could see how these candidates, Pam Harris and Shang Tao, fared among defeated candidates. So you see here that Pam Harris was able to pick up more number 2 and number 3 support from defeated candidates total. Here you see that she was able to pick up more votes from Matt Hummel and Joseph Simmons. And that number is slight, but it's still good to know. The ranked choice voting did favor her. However, the win was not enough to overcome that gap from that first choice support that Tao had. That was 7% lead that she had in the first round. So that provided her with enough of a buffer where she could lose some ranked choice voting support and still come up on top. So we'll move on to District 6. Here we saw this race went into multiple rounds. However, the Alameda ROV stopped the count before eliminating Maya Whittaker from the race. What we saw in this race was another incumbent being unseated. Dudley Brooks came in second place to Lauren Taylor in that first round and ultimately lost the ranked choice voting count as well. Lauren Taylor had 40.1% in the first round. Dudley Brooks had 24.8%. Interesting to note is that when you have over a 1/3% of first choice support, you're going to be a finalist in that ranked choice voting contest. It may not mean you win, but you're going to be a finalist. And here Lauren Taylor was the only candidate out the gate that had that was guaranteed to be a finalist in that race. Clearly, Maya Whittaker would have had to have a lot of support from the defeated candidates to overcome Dudley Brooks, and that didn't happen. But we saw that in the final count, Lauren Taylor, when you narrow the race down to 2, accounting for Maya Whittaker's second and third choice support candidates from her supporters, Lauren Taylor wins 65 to Dudley Brooks' 35%. So we'll move jurisdictions now. Here is the San Leandro mayoral election. There were 3 candidates challenging the incumbent Mayor Pauline Cutter, who was elected in 2014. And it was a pretty straightforward race. It was decided in 1 round, but Pauline Cutter is a very popular mayor. However, voters still engaged with the ranked choice voting ballots. They, 72.5% indicated at least 2 different preferences on their ballots. However, Pauline Cutter won outright in the first round with 51.8. When you narrow the race down to 2, she wins over Benny Lee with 63.8. A pretty decisive win, and I think it really shows her mandate of support among San Leandro voters. We'll move on to District 1 in San Leandro. This was also decided in 1 round, where 2 to 3 voters indicated 2 to 3 different candidates. 70.4% of them did that. And this was an outright win, pretty decisive for Deborah Cox, who won in the first round with 65.2% of first choice votes. That's pretty huge. And in the final count, when you narrow the race down to 2, she comes up 74.5% to Kenneth Pond's 25.5. And then now we'll jump across the Bay Bridge and we'll go into the San Francisco Board of Supervisors elections. So we saw elections in District 2, District 4, District 6, District 8, and District 10. What I'll say very quickly about District 8 is that we won't go into that race because that race was a competitive race that happened in June, and because of the rules of the San Francisco Charter, he was only Rafael Manoman who won that election, had to run again in November, and there was not a lot of competition. There was one challenger who didn't run a strong campaign, and he won pretty decisively in that election. But it wasn't a ranked choice voting election in the sense that there weren't more than 2 candidates, so we're not really going into that race. But what I'll say about District 2, a little background, is that in 2018, termed out District 2 Supervisor Mark Farrell was appointed to serve as the interim mayor of San Francisco until the June 2018 election that happened. So his vacancy was filled with the appointment of the county clerk, Catherine Stefani. There were 4 candidates vying for that open seat, which is technically an open seat, but Catherine Stefani was filling that role through the election. And in District 4, Supervisor Katie Tang had announced that she would not seek re-election. So actually, this was a pretty big deal because this was the first ranked choice voting election without an incumbent in District 4 since 2006. So it was an open field, and a lot of people jumped into that race. Usually, a lot of these candidates announce that they're going to run for a district's supervisor seat like a year in advance. Here, we saw a very small timeline because that announcement, came in so late. And in June, this was really like a 6-month race in sprint. Okay, so let's jump into District 2, and actually let's go back and kind of talk about District 6 really quick. And in District 6, we had an open seat left by termed out Supervisor Jane Kim, and in District 10, there were 6 candidates vying for that District 10 seat left open by termed out Supervisor Malia Cohen. So now let's go into District 2. This was a 3-round election. 72.9% of voters had at least 2 different candidates on their ballots. This was actually a really positive thing for us to see, just because we hadn't seen District 2 ranked choice voting elections be, we had a very engaged electorate in District 2 this season. We hadn't seen voters in District 2 use their rankings as much as they did this time, and that was really great to see. And it's strange because District 2 is a very affluent, very educated district in San Francisco, so it was great to see them engage with the ranked ballots. Catherine Stefani had 40.8% in that first round, and then the final count, she wins 51.9% to 48.1%. She was able to pick up more support from trailing candidates than her opponent. Let's go to District 4. Oh, we're having a little bit of a technical issue here. So I'm not seeing the slide. Hello?
Apologies for the technical difficulties, but while Sean is pulling up that District 4 slide, can you tell us a little bit about what happened there, Pedro, since we've got about 8 minutes left?
Yeah, I will do my best. So District 4 went into 7 rounds. 76.4% had 2 to 3 different choices. Gordon Marr came out of the gate in the first round with 36.6. This was seen as a 2-person race between her and former Katy Tang legislative aide Jessica Ho. The only way that McNeil, who had 12.3%, could overcome was to overwhelmingly have the second choice support of all the other voters who supported the trailing candidates, and that wasn't really going to happen. So we really did see a two-person race under ranked choice voting here. In the final count, Gordon Marr ends up winning 56.8 to Jessica Ho's 48.1. And the next slide, we show you how that support went. We were able to see that Gordon Marr picked up more second and third choice support from all defeated candidates. So he just essentially just maintained his lead. Trevor McNeil and Jessica Ho did have a ranked choice voting strategy that didn't necessarily manifest itself, since more of his voters ended up picking Gordon Marr. And people often ask me, like, why do you think that was? We go back to, campaign 101 is that you have to identify your base of support. It seemed like the McNeil and Ho bases and communities necessarily did not align in terms of like their values and ideas. So this was, I think, a race really decided by retail politics and really decided by, the campaigns reaching out to voters and asking for their support directly, rather than, how the candidates were aligning themselves. And what you saw Gordon Marr do is pick up that second and third choice support from voters directly. So in San Francisco Board of Supervisors District 6, this was a one-round election where Matt Haney won outright in the first round with 56.4%. Christine Johnson had 24.7%, and Sonia Traus had 18.8%. Sonia Traus and Christine Johnson did run a ranked choice voting strategy that a lot of people saw, and the media, it was all over the media, it was all over commercials. Their ranked choice voting strategy was preempted by that first round win because Matt Haney had over majority of first choice counts, but we narrowed the race down to 2. San Francisco narrows down the race down to 2, and you're able to see, but we visualize it too. But here we see that Matt Haney wins 63.1 to Christine Johnson's 36.9. So in the next slide, you get to see how much of that Sonia Traus support goes to Christine Johnson, and it's actually substantial. 69.3% of votes that transferred from Sonia Traus go to Christine Johnson, showing that there was a strong showing of shared bases and values and interests. However, here Matt Haney was the clear winner. So here we have the San Francisco Board of Supervisors District 10, and there were 6 candidates vying for that District 10 seat. This was really a 3-way race between Shamon Walton, Tony Kelly, and Theo Ellington. And the reason why is, if we go to the next slide, we see that Shamon Walton led with 41.3% in the first round. Tony Kelly had 24.6%, and Theo Ellington had 20.8%. And there were the 3 strongest candidates in this race. This was, I believe, Tony Kelly's 3rd time running for office. He has a strong base of support in Potrero Hill. However, and Shamon Walton had a very large field campaign and had a lot of support from, District 10 is a very diverse district, and he was able to break into a lot of these communities and get support from them. But when you run the count down to 2 under ranked choice voting, Shamon Walton ends up getting more number 2 and number 3 support from supporters of Theo Ellington in a way that really sealed up his win, where he ends up winning in that race 63.1 to Tony Kelly's 36.9. So more of Theo Ellington voters ended up supporting Shamon Walton as their next choice and next subsequent choice. So, yep.
We went through a lot, and as we wrap up in the next couple of minutes here, I just wanted to be clear on how these election results were being tabulated as well as being presented. Up and down the state, we saw that there were results not being finalized until well after the election, because here in California, the county registrar's office count their ballots up to 3 days after the election, with the vote by mail ballots being delivered. with that being said, under ranked choice voting, there is no extension of time. It really just takes a matter of minutes once these ballots are being counted to run the full tabulations for how voters ranked their ballots. So I want to make that clear. The second thing that we wanted to share with everyone is that in the next slide, we can see that come in the near future, both San Francisco County and Alameda County will be upgrading the voting equipment. So we're excited to see up to 10 rankings with better ballot design so folks can intuitively know how to rank their first, second, third choices and so on. So we'll continue to work with the Registrar of Voters and all of you to make sure that that process goes seamlessly. And then finally, we just wanted to thank you for joining us on this webinar. If you signed up to be a part of this or signed up to be on our list, we'll make sure to share the PowerPoint presentations with you. This upcoming weekend, we're going to have a summit with supporters from around the region to talk about ranked choice voting and how we can continue to advance this issue. We're also going to be hosting an awards reception and honoring some of our champions of democracy. Once again, stay involved. Contact us at info@fairvoteca.org if you have any questions about this presentation or any other information about ranked choice voting. We'd love to share with you. And join us on Facebook, Twitter, and our email list. With that being said, I just want to thank you. Once again, this is Jennifer Pei, Director of Fairvote California, and then my friend and colleague, Pedro. You want to say thank you too?
Thank you all so much. Hope to see you this weekend.
Awesome.